Hi there, today I'm going to be talking about my favorite Latin American books. There's some drilling going on in the background. Stop now, might come back. Hope it doesn't come back. They've been working on this temple across the road for ages and I just want them to stop. Anyway, apologies if there's any drilling. So in reverse order of preference, here are my top three. First of all, I want you to go back to the 1960s and remember this is a time of political upheaval and Cold War inspired fear of global catastrophe and revolutionary activism where, all over the world young people are taking to the streets and demanding social change. Gee, it's so hard to imagine a world like that, isn't it? This is also a time of immense creativity all over the world. So young people are not only using their imaginations to think of like what kind of society we can build for the future, but also they're creating incredible art everywhere. Who would have guessed that 50 years later, those bright young things who were changing society and dreaming of the future would be grumbling boomers saying that, oh, I wish things were as they were a few years ago, and those young people, haven't they gone a little bit too far? Speaking of booms, this was the time of the Latin American boom. So in Latin America, there was this explosion of creativity and brilliant literature. And this literature not only spread across Latin America, but was picked up by Spanish publishing houses and then spread all across Europe as well. That's something like most people don't realize, that internationalism was so hot in the 1960s. Like these, not just these publishing companies, like not just big mainstream things, but all sorts of artists and creatives and intellectuals were really interested in other nations and other cultures and just learning as much as they could from all over the world, and I think that's something that's kind of missing from our own moment. But anyway, of all the books of the Latin American boom, there was one of them which has endured more than the others in the sense that it's probably as, if not more, globally loved today than it was at the time. And that book is, of course, 100 Years of Solitude, written by Colombian writer and Latin American demigod Gabriel Garcia Marquez. 100 Years of Solitude follows the Buendia family as they found a town called Macondo, and then the novel follows the fortunes of that family through several generations as well as the town as it develops. So this book is basically the one which is most associated with the genre of magical realism, which by the way was practically invented during the Latin American boom, and it's practically the Bible of Latin American literature, and as such, it inspires quite a lot of strong opinions. For me personally, I don't love it as much as my friends and people I know who've read it, but I still love it. It introduced to me a lot of things that I'd never seen before in fiction, and I think those things existed, I just hadn't seen them before, you know what I mean? So this was the first family saga that I ever read where, blood is what the plot follows rather than character, and that was really interesting for me. Also, it was a book where the sense of place is so strong. Like Macondo is like a character. The town is like the main character in the book, because while people come and go, the town is always there. And I think some of these things aren't original to 100 Years of Solitude, but for me personally, it was the first time I'd seen them as literature. I remember being so struck by the way that time flows in this novel. It flows at a rate that I hadn't ever experienced before. So for example, I remember being struck maybe around halfway through the novel that one of the main characters, who I really loved, was gonna die. And it wasn't because of the plot or anything like that. It was just because at the rate that time was moving and at the thickness of the pages that were still left to go that I could feel in my hand, I knew the person couldn't survive that long. So that made me really sad, just suddenly reading the novel and having that realization that, my reading experience is going to outlive you. That's something I'd never experienced before through reading a book. Also, at the same time, I kind of suddenly realized that, oh yeah, it's called 100 Years of Solitude, and most people don't live 100 years. So there is going to be a lot of death in this book. As for the magical realism stuff, I think it's important to remember that magical realism was originally a European concept, which was applied to Latin American things. So it had been used to describe loads of things before the boom, but the sense that we understand it today as a genre is based on the Latin American books. The origin of it as a European concept is also important because, Latin American writers didn't ascribe this to their novels as they were writing them. And Marquez said something I really liked. I don't remember the exact quote, but it's basically what Europeans call magical realism for us is just Latin American realism. And that kind of was something that I loved about this novel, that the magical realist episodes were things that really reminded me of my Latin American family. And a lot of those stories I could really feel them as though they were being told to me by family members. So I think everyone will have different magical realist episodes from the novel that will stick with them, just because there's so many. It's like there's so many little stories held together there, and different ones will stick in your mind. I think my favorite one of those is this one where a character dies and their blood trickles in a little line which goes all the way through the town, like around corners and everything like that, and it's just zooming around until eventually it gets to Ursula's kitchen and goes under the door into the kitchen. And Ursula is like the matriarch of the Buendia family, and she's like cutting onions or something, and then she turns around and she sees the blood on the floor and she's like, Jesus Christ. And so she runs out and she chases after the blood, and she follows it all the way, like winding back through town, through the streets, until she gets to the place where she finds that her son has been murdered. And it's like, but it's funny, it's like, the reactions are brilliant and super Latin, and it's also sad, and I don't know, it's got so much going on. And of course the magical blood is not the main point, it's just one interesting facet of the more important story, which is about family and so on. It's also important to remember that not all the magical realism stuff is supernatural. And of this kind of magical realism, where there's no supernatural things, there was another example which really made a huge impact on me. And this was to do with the plantation. So one of the Buendia family members works at I think a banana plantation, which is owned by an American corporation, and all the workers are striking, and then the law enforcement just opens fire and massacres everybody. And miraculously, the one Buendia family member survives all this, and he goes back to Macondo and he tells everyone what happened, and they don't believe him because it's too far-fetched. And this was like amazing for me. I mean, it makes sense that it's magical realism because there's a town and a huge portion of its labor is just suddenly massacred and nobody will believe it. I loved how Marquez shows that Latin American realism can be really beautiful and tolerant in the way it accepts fantasy as a natural part of storytelling there, but it also has this dangerous and kind of frightening side, in the sense that, you know, like evidence and facts are sometimes discarded if they're not useful for a good story, and sometimes they are necessary for things like justice. Macondo isn't a whimsical fairyland version of Latin America. It's got really harsh realities. So in Macondo, in this episode, you see an American corporation, and then the local law enforcement, and even the just normal ordinary citizens of the town all being complicit in the massacre and exploitation of these workers. And that's something which, I don't know, I'd love to go back to now, because when I read it I was quite young, and even then the politics made a big impression on me. So now that I know way more, I think I would get a lot more out of reading that book. The sun is really shy today, which is why I keep getting darker and darker throughout this video, but hopefully the clouds will... No, I can hear rain now. Okay. So my next book is kind of cheating because it's not really a Latin book. It's a compilation of stories from different Latin books, different compilations of stories, and put together and translated into English. Yeah, I should mention that I haven't read any of these books in Spanish because my Spanish is trash, but the translations are often acclaimed, and anyway, they're great, so get off my back. This book is called Blow Up and Other Short Stories by the Argentinian writer Julio Cortázar. These short stories had such a huge impact on me as a teenager reading them, on my imagination really. And like I found recently this like a bunch of writing that I did from my teens and my early 20s, and reading it now I'm just like, oh my god, this is just knockoff Cortázar. I'm really hoping in like 10 years when I look back on my writing now, I'm not going to say the same thing. For me, almost all of these short stories are not magical realism, because even though they do blend the mundane with the magical, they kind of focus more on psychological depth, and they focus on how we get from one thing, mundane thing, to the magical thing, whatever it is. Like often the connection between like mundane life and something magical is the whole point of the story, unlike something in like Marquez where it's not the point really, it's just part of the story. To take an example, there's this one called Axolotl. This is an axolotl, for those who don't know what an axolotl is. The story of axolotl here, spoilers for axolotl, is the story of a guy who is obsessed with axolotls. And he goes to the aquarium every single day to look at the axolotls that they have there. He gets to know the guard because he's always going back and forth. And, he's just describing it. This is only like a 2 or 3 page short story, by the way. But every day his obsession becomes more intense, and he's looking at them, and there's something about their little eyes and their little gills that he gets more and more obsessed. And then there's a turning point where he becomes an axolotl, or something happens where like his consciousness gets stuck inside the body of an axolotl. It's a metamorphosis. It's a guy changing into an animal, but it's not like, a Harry Potter sort of axolotlus, like wand thing. It's like it's all about the writing. It's all about how he writes a shift of like being and consciousness. It's like you're really in his head. It's so psychological and absurd. It's really obviously absurd and kind of funny, but also kind of freaky and creepy, and a sense of being trapped and lost in the body of a creature which isn't your body. Like Edgar Allan Poe had a really big influence on a lot of Latin American writers, but I think you can really feel that in a lot of Cortázar's stories, especially. Like there is some freaky shit, and like I don't think I'm really spoiling the stories by telling them, because the power of them is all in their language, in the telling. Like how he plays with language, especially with pronouns. Like he keeps in the axolotl story, keeps mixing I's and he's, because first it's I and then it's he, because he's looking at himself as an axolotl, and the way he uses grammar to create uncertainty and to break up the stability of what we think of as the narrator and as the protagonist or the subject of the story. It's so good. Like, it's not spoiling, because to spoil it would just be say, like, the story is about a man who turns into an axolotl. That's it. There's really not much more plot to it than that. So if plot is your thing, then I guess you don't need to read Axolotl. But if you're interested in incredible writing and just an amazing reading experience, then yes, you do need to read Axolotl. I want to give one more example to show, like, to give some variation, but also to show, like, the similarity between different types of stories that he does. So this one is called Letter to a Lady in Paris. I didn't read all these stories in one go, because I usually, the way I read short stories collections is I dip in and out of them, and over like years. And Axolotl was something which I loved when I was younger, and then like Letter to a Lady in Paris just made so much sense to me when I was a little bit older. And like, from the teens to the 20s, it's a big change. And this one really got me. So in this story, it's about a guy, and he's taking care of a friend's flat, or a lady's flat. We presume it's a friend, I guess, for a couple of months. And when he's in the lift going up to the flat, then he suddenly vomits up a tiny rabbit. And he's like, oh shit, I vomited a rabbit. And this is like not like a strange thing for him, because it's just happened to him all through his life. As long as he can remember, he occasionally vomits up tiny little rabbits, like little Easter-sized rabbits, but alive rabbits, like actual animals. And it's just a private thing, it's something that's kind of gross, so obviously he doesn't go around talking about it, but it's just, a fact of his life. But he's surprised now because he didn't think he would be vomiting up rabbits while staying at his friend's apartment. The whole story is just him maintaining the apartment and occasionally vomiting up a rabbit, and then having to take care of that as well, because he doesn't want to kill them. And he has to like stop them from like gnawing at the woodwork, and from eating the books on the bottom shelf, and he's always like kind of having to feed them, as well as just take care of the flat. And it's just like daily existence, but you can feel him starting to lose control, basically. And his friends are calling on him, and they want to like hang out, and he's like has to make up excuses because he has to stay at the flat to take care of the rabbits. And this sense of like just like doing daily things and starting to lose your sense of control over them, it's so relatable. He eventually reaches a breaking point, and I'm not going to say what happened because I really want you to read this, but I will say that like that the way that the breaking point is described is something which has stuck with me forever. And I actually searched the line on the internet, and I'll read it to you. He says, "As for me, from the 10th to the 11th, there's an insurmountable void." He's talking about the rabbits. "You see, 10 was fine. With a wardrobe, clover, and hope, so many things can be put in place. Not so with 11. For 11 inevitably means 12, Andre. 12 who becomes 13. I love that. Like, that difference between 10 and 11 rabbits is just the point where he knows, okay, that's it. Everything's fucked. And it's so arbitrary and silly, but it's also like kind of real and like tragic, and I don't know, I really feel like there's something so true about that, you know, like we all have our own 11th rabbit. 10 rabbits is like, okay, I got this, it's difficult, I'm struggling, but as long as I keep trying my best, things will work out okay in the end. And then 11 rabbits, well, that's it, isn't it? It's fucked. Everything's fucked. It's like Alice in Wonderland for depressives. So basically, if you like your angst surreal and with plenty of animals, please read Cortázar. And finally, the number one spot, my favorite book of all time, actually, it's Pedro Páramo by the Mexican novelist Juan Rulfo. Now this book was before the Latin American boom, I think in the 50s, and it was a precursor to magical realism. Gabriel Garcia Marquez liked this book so much that he memorized it and could say it verbatim. Or at least so he says, like that might be some Latin American realism coming through there. But nonetheless, like you can really see the influence, even though I wouldn't call Pedro Páramo magical realism. I first found out about this book when my friend's mother, who was a writer, lent me a book which was about writing. It was something like How to Read Like a Writer, or hang on, I'll look it up. It was called Reading Like a Writer by the unrealistically named Francine Prose. And basically in this book, there was like a section which was talking about openings, like how to open a novel, or how, like it gave just examples of brilliant openings of novels. And two of those were so brilliant that they stuck with me, and I had to find the rest of the novel to see how it continued, because the opening narrative hooks were so good. And those ones were The Marquis of O by Kleist and Pedro Páramo. And those two ended up being like two of my favorite writers ever of all time. So that book was really useful, at least for my reading, if not for my writing. Pedro Páramo is the only book that Juan Rulfo ever wrote, because why the hell would he need to write another book after writing this one? You can just imagine, can't you, like Rulfo finishing his masterpiece and being like, that's it, I did it. I don't need to write anymore. All my writing is done. It's all here. Perfect. So basically the opening is that there's a woman and she dies, and on her deathbed she tells her son, go find your father, Pedro Páramo, and get what he owes you. And that's it. That's like, you know, a narrative hook, a quest beginning, a fairy tale kind of feeling. The boy has to go out into the world and find his dad. And that's just the first sentence. And then from there, it just sets up this world, and it keeps changing your expectations. And as he's going, he meets this guy, and they start speaking to each other. And he says, where are you going? I'm going to a place called Comala, which is where Pedro Páramo lives. And as they talk, like, we start learning things, just that like really important plot points are dropped just casually in this conversation, and they're quite shocking. And like the whole quest narrative is already being subverted just in the first few pages. Like even as it's being introduced, it's being subverted, and we're starting to feel like unsettled. It's unsettling, that's what it is. It's like it makes you feel uneasy the way they talk about things, and there's this malice that comes through but isn't exactly directly spoken, and it's just, you gotta read it. Now before long they get to Comala, and Comala is where you see the huge influence on Marquez, because like his Macondo in 100 Years of Solitude, Comala is like a character and also kind of like the soul of this novel. But the difference is that whereas Macondo is sort of like a more lively place, you know, like full of life, Comala is full of death, and it's got like, it's dry and it's barren. And yeah, I think the sense of place and sense of local history are things which are you know, Marquez kind of borrowed for his novel. But the sense of landscape, you know, like the earth and the stars and the mountains and the dry barren plains, that is very, very Rulfo, very Pedro Páramo. It's just like such a desolate, haunted place, and it's haunted literally because there's ghosts everywhere. This is a ghost story. What this novel is a modernist ghost story. Now like modernism, you know, it's this reaction to the dichotomy of realism and romanticism, where there was a sort of, in both of those there was this omniscient narrator, and what modernism does is it gets rid of that narrative voice, and instead it breaks up the writing. It makes it fragmentary, it makes it really experimental and descriptive. It puts lots of voices going on together at the same time, and like it moves around things from different times and different places, so it's really disjointed. Yeah, That's modernism. And then a ghost story is a story where things from the past are stuck in the present. And, like people and voices and memories and places that should all be dead are instead like re-emerging back into the current moment and interacting with the living world. And that is something which goes so well with modernism. Like a modernist ghost story. I don't know if I'm just like, I'd never read any of these before. I don't know any other modernist ghost stories. If you know a modernist ghost story, please tell me. Because it seems that with Pedro Páramo, I found just like the perfect matchup here. They work so well together. It's not just fragmentary. It's also like modernism is famous for stream of consciousness and this kind of dreamlike flow of words and impressions coming together, and you really get that in Pedro Páramo as well. Like it's not always clear who is speaking and if the person who is speaking is alive or dead, and if the person they're speaking to is alive or dead, and that sense of not knowing what's going on is all the way through, and yet it's so readable. Like the story is so good. It's so like such a fairy tale like story. Like it's that amazing balance of having something which is really kind of abstract in its writing as well as beautiful, and then having that really narrative satisfaction of knowing like the story beats that have to play out and getting those story beats delivered to you. Like the opening quest narrative fairy tale thing of the mother and the son and going off, and that isn't abandoned. That he really delivers on that. And that's just, how does he find that balance? I have no idea. So on the one hand, you have a book which is really fragmentary and fleeting in the way that it describes things, and full of gorgeous language that's almost like poetry. And then on the other hand, you have this incredibly well-crafted narrative where you really get a sense of place. You get a sense of the people. There's the priest in town, there's the prostitute, there's the landowner. There's like, you really know Comala so well, even though it's all broken up and messed up like this. And you also get this sort of like sense that every little narrative chunk is just perfect. Like the way that it fits together like clockwork, like every word feels well chosen. That is the sign of an incredibly good novel, where every word seems to fall into place, and like you get that payoff. It delivers on the narrative promises that it makes at the beginning, despite the fact that there is a huge thing that happens, not really a twist, but a huge thing that happens around the middle of the book, when I won't say what it is because I definitely want people to read this and go into it the way I did, like not knowing anything. But this thing that happens, I will just say that is something that I did not know you are allowed to do as a writer. When I read it and I thought, what? Like, you can't do that. You just can't do that and expect to, that the story will be able to continue and be a good story. And it did. It does. It's incredible. So this book is actually unlike Cortázar's short stories because I don't think it had a really formative effect on me or my imagination, except maybe to sort of solidify things that I like and make me realize things that I liked. But it didn't need to, because like when I read it, it's just perfect. For me, it is the perfect novel, and I don't think anything could ever replace it. So there you go. That is my top 3 Latin American books. There's plenty more that I want to read. At the moment, I have a big tome by Roberto Bolaño, the 2666 book. I don't know how you say it, 2666. Anyway, I have that book that I really want to read. And I also have a bunch of short stories by Clarice Lispector from Brazil and Mario Benedetti from Uruguay, I think. I hope it's Uruguay. But yeah, if there's any book that you think that I absolutely have to read by Latin American writers, then please let me know the title. See you next time.